The morning my son stood in my kitchen doorway and told me I wasn't welcome at his daughter's first birthday party. I was holding a homemade lemon cake I had spent 3 hours baking. I remember the way the frosting had cracked slightly on one side, because I had been so nervous decorating it that my hands wouldn't stay still. I'd been up since 5 that morning. The house smelled like warm sugar and vanilla, and my son Caleb stood there in his expensive wool coat, eyes somewhere past my shoulder, telling me that Renata thought it would be better if I didn't come. Better for who? I almost asked. But I already knew the answer wasn't me. I set the cake down carefully on the counter. Then I smiled the way mothers learn to smile when grief needs somewhere to hide. Of course, I said softly. I understand. I did not understand, not even close. But I smiled anyway, and Caleb left, and I sat alone in my kitchen beside a birthday cake nobody was going to eat, finally allowing myself to cry. That was the moment everything changed. People who meet me now see a retired school teacher with silver hair and reading glasses. She's always losing in her own house. They see a woman who tends a small garden in suburban Columbus, Ohio, who hosts neighborhood book clubs on Thursday evenings, who brings homemade soup to anyone on the street who seems under the weather. They assume I've always been this settled, this calm, this content. They don't see the 40 years I spent pouring myself into one person, then watching that person slowly disappear inside a marriage that was never as perfect as it looked on the outside. My name is Louise Harmon, and for most of my adult life, every important decision I made circled back to my son. Caleb was 7 years old when his father walked out. Not dramatically. Not with yelling or broken dishes, or any of the theatrical exits people imagine when they hear the word divorce. Warren simply packed a single bag one Tuesday evening, told me our marriage had run its course, and drove away in the direction of a woman named Sandra, whom he'd apparently been seeing for over a year. I stood at the front window, watching his taillights disappear down our quiet street while Caleb slept upstairs, completely unaware that his family had just changed shape forever. That night, after I stopped shaking enough to think clearly, I made a decision. Caleb would never feel that absence the way I did. He would never go without. He would never lie awake, wondering whether things were going to be okay. I went back to teaching full-time the following month. Then I took on tutoring in the evenings. I managed a summer school program for 12 years straight without taking a single break because the extra stipend meant Caleb could do the science camp he wanted, the baseball travel league, the after-school robotics program. When he got accepted to Ohio State, I cried for 20 minutes in my car before driving home to cook his favorite dinner. My colleagues used to joke that I ran on coffee and determination. What they didn't know was that I ran on fear. Quiet, constant, relentless fear that I would somehow fail the one person left depending on me. But Caleb and I were close in ways that made that fear almost worth carrying. On Sunday mornings we made pancakes and argued about baseball. He called me after every exam in college, good results and bad ones both. When his father eventually reached out years later wanting to reconnect, it was Caleb who called me first to ask how I felt about it. Not because he was asking permission, because my feelings mattered to him. That version of my son was real. I want to be clear about that, because what came later sometimes makes people assume the closeness was always an illusion. It wasn't. The closeness was genuine. What changed it had a name. Renata Voss came into Caleb's life at a company networking event during his 3rd year working in Columbus commercial real estate. He told me about her carefully, almost tentatively, the way you describe something fragile that you're afraid to damage by handling it wrong. She's different, Mom. She knows exactly what she wants. I liked that description at first. A woman who knew what she wanted sounded like a woman with direction, with confidence. I was raised to respect both. The first time I met Renata Voss, she arrived 40 minutes late to our lunch, sat down without apologizing, and spent most of the meal talking about her family's investment portfolio, in ways that required to quietly translate for me afterward. Not translate in language. Translate in meaning. She assumed everyone around her understood the world she lived in, and she had zero curiosity about any other kind. I told myself I was being uncharitable. First impressions are imperfect. People are nervous. I gave her every reasonable benefit I could manufacture. But the comments started almost immediately. Small ones at first, the way small things always start when someone is testing how much resistance they'll encounter. At Caleb's 32nd birthday dinner, I wore a blue dress I loved and the pearl earrings he'd bought me the previous Christmas. Renata looked at my shoes briefly and then looked away without expression. 2 days later, Caleb mentioned casually over the phone that Renata thought I might enjoy updating my wardrobe a little, that it might help me feel more confident at social events. I was 61 years old. I had taught high school English for 38 years. I had raised a son by myself on a teacher's salary in a city where that kind of salary doesn't go as far as it should. My wardrobe was fine. My confidence was not the issue, but I stayed quiet because Caleb sounded uncomfortable, and I didn't want him caught in the middle. That was my first mistake. There would be others. After Caleb and Renata got engaged, the spending started, not urgently. Gradually, the way a river rises before people realize a flood is coming. The engagement party at a private club downtown that cost more than my monthly pension. The honeymoon to the Amalfi Coast. The condominium in the short north neighborhood that ran well above what Caleb's salary alone could comfortably support. I assumed Renata came from family money. She carried herself that way. But assumptions are expensive. And I was too busy wanting Caleb to be happy to ask the questions I should have been asking. What I knew was this. I had a retirement savings account, a modest inheritance from my own mother, and a house I'd owned outright for 11 years. And somehow, piece by piece, those things began to feel less like my security and more like a shared resource. Renata had simply decided to include in her financial planning. It started with the condo down payment. Caleb asked carefully, framing it as a loan, promising specifics about repayment. I said yes because he was my son, and because I wanted him settled, and because saying no felt like withholding something he deserved. Those are the quiet reasons parents overextend themselves. Not weakness. Love that hasn't learned to say enough yet. Then came the car lease, co-signed under my name because Renata's credit history was being restructured. Then the private membership to a social club where Caleb said networking happened that couldn't happen anywhere else. Then a home renovation loan that passed through an account I barely recognized months after agreeing to let my name be attached to it. Each request came through Caleb. Each time he seemed slightly embarrassed asking, which I took for a good sign. Embarrassed meant he still understood the weight of what he was asking. What I didn't realize was that embarrassment can also be performance, that sometimes people know exactly what they're doing and feel absolutely nothing about it. Renata, I learned slowly, felt nothing about a great many things. The wedding should have warned me. Not because it was expensive, though it was, because during the entire rehearsal dinner, across a meal I had partially funded, Renata's mother Carol Voss referred to me twice as Caleb's mother, with a particular inflection that made the phrase sound like a job description rather than a relationship. And Renata never corrected her, just smiled and moved the conversation forward the way someone moves furniture to cover a stain in the floor. After the wedding, I saw Caleb differently. Not less, differently. He called less often. When we did speak, his sentences were shorter, more guarded, like he was listening to a second conversation happening somewhere nearby and dividing his attention between both. I recognized that split focus. I'd seen it in students going through difficult things at home, the particular exhaustion of managing two separate emotional worlds at once. I told myself he was adjusting to marriage, that newlyweds naturally recalibrate their relationships, that I needed to give space generously and without scorekeeping. So I gave and the space grew. And then one evening, my financial advisor Beverly Harmon called me sounding careful. Beverly had been managing my retirement accounts for over a decade. She was methodical, soft-spoken, and almost never called outside scheduled appointments. When I heard her voice on a Wednesday night, my stomach tightened before she finished saying hello. "Louise," she said, "have you reviewed the activity on the joint savings account recently?" I frowned. The joint account had been set up years earlier as a convenience for household emergencies, back when Caleb was living with me briefly after college. I'd never fully closed it because the transition felt unnecessary. "Not recently," I admitted. "Why?" Beverly paused in the way people pause when they're choosing words carefully. "There have been some withdrawals I'd like you to look at." She sent the statements to my email that same night. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, looking at numbers I didn't recognize attached to dates I couldn't account for. Cash transfers. Subscription charges to businesses I'd never heard of. A wire to something called Voss Capital Holdings that I had absolutely no memory of authorizing. Voss, Renata's family name. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while. Then I called my friend and former colleague Doris Langley, who had spent 20 years as a paralegal before retiring to teach with me. It was late, but Doris answered on the second ring the way good friends do. "Something's wrong," I told her. "I think something has been wrong for longer than I realized." The next morning, Doris came to my house with coffee and the name of an attorney she trusted. His name was Arthur Clement. She'd worked with him years earlier on an estate dispute and described him as the kind of man who spoke plainly and moved carefully and didn't pretend a situation was simple when it wasn't. I called his office that same afternoon. Arthur Clement met with me 3 days later, reviewed the statements Beverly had printed, asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself, and then sat very still for a moment before speaking. "Louise," he said, "you may want to contact your bank about restricting access to that account before our next meeting." I looked at him steadily. "How serious is this?" He folded his hands. "Serious enough that I don't want to speculate until I have more information. But serious." That night I barely slept. Not because of the money, though the money mattered. Because I kept returning to the same question I'd been avoiding for months. Had Caleb known? Had he participated? Or had he simply looked the other way because looking in the other direction was easier than whatever conversation would have followed? I wanted desperately for the answer to be that he didn't know. That Renata had acted alone, moving through accounts quietly while Caleb remained unaware. People who love their children will construct almost any explanation to protect that love from a conclusion they can't survive. But I also knew my son, and somewhere underneath the hoping was the quiet that Caleb had been in that house, living that life, watching those numbers, for 2 years. The birthday party refusal came 1 week after I restricted the joint account. Caleb hadn't mentioned the account when he came to my door. He'd stood in my kitchen and said only that Renata felt the gathering should be immediate family, that it was important to keep the environment consistent for the baby, and that he hoped I understood. I noticed he didn't look at me when he said it. After he left, I called Arthur. "She knows," I told him. "They know the account access changed, and this is the response." Arthur was quiet for a moment. "I think you're right," he said, "and I think we should move faster than we planned." The calls I made the following week were the hardest of my life. Not the bank, not the credit union. The hardest call was to the lender holding the home renovation loan. Renata had directed through my name. Because the woman on the phone was kind and professional and completely unprepared for the sound I made when she read me the outstanding balance. It was 3 times what Caleb had told me it was. I sat down slowly on my kitchen floor, not dramatically. My legs simply stopped working the way they sometimes do when your body processes information before your mind catches up. I stayed there for a few minutes. Then I got up, made tea, called Beverly, called Arthur, and began the process of dismantling the financial architecture that had been quietly built around me without my full understanding. 3 days after I began withdrawing support, Caleb called. His voice carried the particular controlled tension of someone who had rehearsed the conversation beforehand and was trying to sound casual anyway. "Mom, there's a problem with the renovation account." "Yes," I said. A pause. "The lender is asking questions." "I know." Another pause, longer. "What did you do?" The question landed strangely. Not what happened. Not is everything okay. Not can we talk about this. What did you do? As though the act of discovering what had been done to me was itself the offense. "I protected myself," I said quietly. "Something I should have done much earlier." Caleb's voice shifted then, less controlled. "Renata is upset. We have obligations that depend on." "Caleb!" I kept my voice even. "The renovation loan is 3 times what you told me. There are transfers to an account I've never authorized. And your daughter turned 1-year-old this week without her grandmother there. I need you to think carefully about which part of all that upsets you most." The silence afterward was very long. He didn't apologize. He said he needed time to sort things out. He said Renata was under pressure. He said I was making things harder than they needed to be. And then, before hanging up, He said something that I have turned over in my mind many times since. He said, "I didn't think you'd actually do anything." That sentence told me more than any confession could. Because it meant the behavior had continued. Not because anyone believed I wouldn't eventually notice, but because they had all decided, at some point, that I wouldn't act. I had trained everyone around me to believe that my love was unconditional enough to absorb anything, and I had done it so thoroughly that when I finally stopped absorbing, it felt to them like a betrayal. The next weeks were not peaceful. I don't want to describe them as though setting boundaries produces immediate clarity and calm, because it doesn't. It produces chaos first. Then, eventually, something on the other side of chaos that is better than what came before. Renata called once. I didn't answer. She texted twice, both messages variations of the same theme. That I was damaging Caleb's stability, that a good mother wouldn't do this, that I had no idea how much pressure they were under. She did not ask how I was. She did not mention the birthday party. She did not acknowledge the money, just the pressure they were under. I showed the messages to Arthur. He photographed them and added them to a folder. Carol Voss called from a number I almost didn't recognize. Her voice was warm in the particular way. Voices become warm when warmth has a purpose. She spoke about family unity and about how these misunderstandings can spiral unnecessarily. About how her daughter loved Caleb deeply and had perhaps managed the financial side of things a little aggressively, but always with the family's best interest at heart. The family's best interest? I asked her gently which family she meant. She didn't have a clear answer for that. Doris came over most evenings during those weeks. She brought food I often forgot to eat and sat with me while I reviewed documents and asked the questions that needed asking. One night, after Arthur called with a preliminary finding that certain account authorizations appeared to contain signatures that hadn't been properly witnessed, Doris watched me set down my phone and stare at the wall for a moment. You knew something was off for a long time, she said. Not accusatory, factual. I knew, I admitted. I kept deciding it was something else. Doris nodded slowly. Because the something else was easier. Because the something else meant Caleb was still who I thought he was. She didn't say anything after that. She didn't need to. The question of how much Caleb knew was the one Arthur answered last. And not completely. And I think that was honest of him, because completely wasn't available. What he could tell me was that several authorizations connected to the renovation account had been processed through a shared email address Caleb had access to. That transfer confirmations had been sent to a phone number registered in both their names. That the account at Voss Capital Holdings where one transfer had landed was not an external business relationship, but a personal holding registered under Renata's family. Whether Caleb had actively participated or simply chosen not to look was a question I had to sit with without a definitive answer, and I learned, slowly, that some questions have to be held rather than resolved. What I could resolve was the financial exposure. Arthur moved methodically. The joint account was formally closed. The renovation loan was restructured under terms that removed my name from primary liability. The car lease was transferred back. Beverly rerouted 2 automatic payments I hadn't even known existed. Each correction felt like taking back a small piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd given away. 6 weeks after the birthday party, Caleb came to my house alone. He knocked rather than using the key he still had. I noticed that. I think he noticed me noticing. I opened the door and stepped aside without speaking. He came in and stood in the living room, looking at the books on the shelf and the photographs on the wall. And the lemon tree I kept on the windowsill that he had given me as a housewarming gift when I moved in 14 years ago. He looked at everything except me. Finally, he sat down. I didn't understand how much of it she was doing, he said. I want to be clear about that. I sat across from him. Tell me what you did understand. He was quiet for a long time. Then, with what looked like genuine effort, he said, I knew about the joint account. I knew there were transfers. I told myself it was temporary, that things would stabilize and we'd pay it back before you ever looked closely. I held very still. And the renovation loan? He looked at his hands. I knew the number was higher than I told you. I didn't know by how much. 3 times, Caleb. He closed his eyes briefly. I know. We sat in that silence for a while. The lemon tree on the windowsill caught afternoon light. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the distance. "Did you ever intend to tell me?" I asked finally. The pause before he answered was answer enough. But he said it anyway. "I don't know. I think I thought it would just eventually work out." Things working out had been Caleb's framework for the entire marriage, I understood then. Not dishonesty, exactly. More like a sustained avoidance of any reckoning. The comfortable belief that if he simply moved forward and didn't examine anything too carefully, the problems would eventually stop being problems. Renata, I suspected, had counted on exactly that. "She moved money without telling me everything," he said quietly. "There are things I found out after you made the calls. Things I didn't know." I studied him carefully. "What things?" He pulled out his phone, turned it toward me. A real estate holding I'd never heard of. Shares registered under his name in a company I didn't recognize. A secondary account that appeared to have received funds, routed through 3 other accounts first. Like water being redirected through pipes before anyone could trace the source. I called Arthur that evening. What followed over the next several weeks was a process I'll describe simply. Everything that had been hidden slowly entered the light. The full scope of Renata's financial activity was larger and more deliberate than even my worst imagining had allowed for. Arthur connected me with a forensic accountant named Gerald Webb, who spent 2 weeks reviewing documents and at the end of those 2 weeks sat down across from me at Arthur's conference table, with an expression I had only seen on people about to say something they wish they didn't have to. "Louise," he said, "this was intentional. The transfers, the accounts, the documents bearing signatures that weren't mine. None of it was the product of aggressive, but essentially innocent financial management. It was constructed, carefully, over time, with a clear understanding of how much I would monitor and how much I would simply trust. I sat very still. Then I asked the question I had been building toward for months. Did my son know the full extent of what she was doing? Gerald Webb looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at me. "We believe," Arthur said carefully, "that Caleb knew enough to understand the pattern. Whether he understood the scope is less clear. It was the most honest answer available." I held it the way Doris had taught me to hold incomplete answers. Not as resolution, as information. By the time legal proceedings formally began, Renata had already begun positioning herself as the misunderstood victim of an overbearing mother-in-law. I'm not saying this bitterly. I'm saying it because I watched it happen in real time, through mutual acquaintances and through the one conversation Caleb reported to me from inside his own marriage. She told him I had always hated her, that I had manufactured the financial concerns to control him, that the real issue was a mother who couldn't let go. Caleb called me the night after she said all of that. He sounded like someone standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged and he can't quite find his footing in the dark. She says, "You've always been against us," he told me. I was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" Another long pause. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have been unfair to you for a very long time." I didn't say anything. I let her decide what kind of relationship you and I were allowed to have, and I told myself that was compromise. But it wasn't. His voice came out rough at the edges. It was cowardice. That sentence cost him something to say. I could hear the cost of it, and I loved him enough not to make him say more than that right then. "Come over on Sunday," I said. "I'll make breakfast." The legal process took months. I won't detail every step, because the truth is that the paperwork and the proceedings and the forensic analysis are not the story. They are the mechanism through which the story resolves itself. What mattered to me was simpler and more private. Renata Voss eventually retained her own attorney and counterpositioned aggressively, as Arthur had predicted she would. Some of the financial claims were settled. Others were formalized into judgments. Gerald Webb testified in a deposition that I was not present for, but that Arthur described afterward as going exactly as expected. Caleb filed for separation 4 months after that first Sunday morning breakfast. I did not celebrate that. I want to be clear about that too. A marriage ending is not a victory. Even a marriage that caused harm. A marriage ending is a person my son loved or believed he loved becoming someone his life would have to reorganize itself around. That is never uncomplicated. But I also watched what happened to Caleb in the months that followed, the tension that left his voice. The way he started finishing sentences again instead of trailing off. The Sunday he showed up to my house early and sat at the kitchen table while I made coffee and talked for almost 2 hours about nothing important. Just baseball scores and a novel I'd been reading, and a former student who'd sent me a letter after 30 years, and I realized about halfway through that conversation that this was the Caleb I'd been missing. The one who'd gotten so quiet inside his own life that I'd stopped hearing him. The granddaughter, Cora, was 14 months old the first time I was allowed to spend real time with her. Caleb brought her over on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn. The light was the color it gets in Ohio in October, pale gold and thin, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory while it's still happening. He set her down on my living room rug, and she immediately crawled toward the basket of toys I had quietly accumulated over the past year, choosing a small stuffed rabbit and regarding it with the focused seriousness that very small children bring to objects of interest. I sat on the floor a few feet away and watched her. My hands were in my lap. I didn't reach for her. I let her do the navigating. After a few minutes, she looked up at me. I smiled. She considered this for a moment. Then she picked up the rabbit and held it toward me. An offering. I took it gently. "Thank you," I told her. She seemed satisfied. Then she crawled over and pulled herself up against my knee and looked up at me with absolute calm, the way very small children look at people who feel safe to them, which is a form of assessment far more accurate than most adults manage. I put my hand on her back very lightly. Caleb was watching from the doorway. When I looked up at him, his eyes were bright. "She never does that," he said quietly. "With new people." I looked back down at Cora. "We're not new people," I told him. "We were just overdue." The conversation Caleb and I have never quite finished is the one about how long he knew, how much he was willing to understand, and how much he kept in a room he didn't open. I think we may have that conversation eventually, in pieces, over years, the way important conversations between parents and children often have to happen. Not all at once, not dramatically, slowly and honestly, and with enough trust rebuilt between the visits to sustain what gets said. What I know now is this. I spent 40 years believing that love for my son required me to make myself smaller whenever my presence caused discomfort, to go quiet when I saw things I should have named, to fund a life I had doubts about rather than voice those doubts and risk his displeasure. I called that protection. I called it devotion. I called it what good mothers do. What it actually was the slow erosion of my own voice. And I did it so completely that by the time the birthday cake sat untouched on my counter and Caleb's taillights disappeared down my street, I had nearly convinced myself that I was the one who should apologize. I don't say that to assign blame to anyone still standing. I say it because I know there are women watching this right now who are doing exactly what I did, who are going quieter every year, who are funding things that don't feel right and saying nothing, who are attending family gatherings as guests in their own children's lives and telling themselves it's fine. It's just how things are now. It's better not to cause problems. It is not fine. And you are not causing problems by expecting to be treated with ordinary decency by the people you raised. Doris told me something the winter everything was still unraveling, on an evening when I was exhausted and not sure I had made the right decisions. She said, "You didn't stop loving him. You stopped subsidizing the conditions under which you were being erased." I think about that often. Cora is 2 years old now. She calls me Lulu because Louise exceeded her early vocabulary and Caleb thought it was funny enough to preserve. She has his eyes and her own personality, which is already entirely her own. Stubborn, curious, affectionate in the particular sudden way that toddlers are affectionate, running toward you without warning and wrapping both arms around your knees like you're the best thing she's found all week. On Sunday mornings now, Caleb brings her to my house and she runs straight to the basket with the stuffed rabbit, and I make coffee, and the three of us exist in each other's company without performing anything for anyone. It is ordinary. It is warm. It is exactly what I almost let slip away quietly, without ever fully realizing it was going. And I am done being quiet about things that matter.